All right, so I'm just going to get started with our training today, recognizing that people will still be coming in. Welcome back to everyone to the USAID T-LTS training on the intersection of transparency, long-term strategies, and transportation. So again, just a reminder, I'm Dorina, and I'm joined again today by Howard, Logan, and Niall, who will be presenting and facilitating the breakout groups later today. Just a few reminders about the training. I think we're all pretty good about it at this point, but just a reminder to mute your microphone when you're not speaking, just to help us reduce background noise in the recording and just for your fellow participants. Highly encourage everyone to use their chat feature to let us know if you have questions or if you want to share anything. It looks like today we have a bit of a smaller group than we did last session. So certainly also, as it permits, feel free to speak up, and we can certainly call on you for the discussion. And I know we're in session 3, so we're getting to know each other a little bit better, but always still helpful if you can introduce yourself, so your name and your organization, so that people know who you are and we can get to know you better. For anyone who missed any part of session 1 or session 2, all the presentations, the exercises, as well as the recordings now are posted on Google Drive. So if you need to access any of that information for reference, it's available for you. And just a reminder for anyone who is interested, if you've attended 75% of the sessions, so 3 of the 4 in total, there will be a certificate of completion that we will send to you just so you have it for your reference. Great. So maybe just moving forward to give an overview of our agenda for today. Great. Thank you, Logan. For today, we're just going to start with a brief recap. We went over about 4 hours of material last week, just to refresh our memories about what the key takeaways were. Then we'll discuss, get into the meat of this session today, which is the approach for developing long-term scenarios. We'll provide an overview of the use of models that could be applied for long-term strategy developments. We'll have an opportunity to do breakout groups and just go through an exercise and have some discussions about some of the opportunities and challenges that each country faces. And we'll close with some remarks and reminders heading into session 4. So, session 1. In our first session, this was a week ago, we initially introduced the concept of a long-term strategy, or an LTS. LTSs, as a reminder, are a document or a strategy or a plan that can help a country set a vision, help prioritize short and midterm actions, and can evolve over time to become more comprehensive. An LTS can work hand in hand with some of the shorter planning tools and documents that you might already have. So this could be a short-term 5 to 10-year sectoral plan, or it could be linked to a country's nationally determined contributions. So the goals that are tied to the Paris Agreement. Transparency is really key. And when we talk about transparency in the context of LTS, we're really referring to the documentation of assumptions, data, and methodologies. So it's a little bit different from, if anyone has worked, I know GoPol, I think you're with the UNFCCC. It's different from the ETF. It's really more about just having good documentation of your process. So as far as transparency goes, it's key to ensuring that your long-term strategy is credible, that it supports your tracking of progress towards the goals that you set, and ultimately it informs your decision making. Transparency and LTS are related to Paris Agreement's objectives and obligations. But as someone noted in our first session, LTSs are encouraged but not actually required by Paris Agreement. And they are neither bound by a specific revision schedule or specific requirements on the structure or what one needs to be included. So it's much more open-ended than what you might see with an NDC. And ultimately, transparency and LTS are both integral to future transport planning. After session one, we talked on session 2, where we focused a bit more on the transportation side of things. We went over the avoid, shift, and improve, or the ASI framework, which provides a comprehensive approach to advance sustainable mobility outcomes. The ASI framework was developed and used in Germany first, but has then been adopted by organizations such as SLOCAT. So if you recall, Nicola had joined us from SLOCAT. It's something that he uses in his work. Transportation mitigation, oops, 1 second. Apologies. Transportation mitigation activities or policies can often be organized into more than one ASI pillar. So an activity might be considered a shift action as well as an improve action, for example. These transportation activities can impact other development goals, such as quality of life, energy security, and other environmental benefits. So when practitioners such as yourselves are thinking about weighing the pros and cons, generally you would look beyond just the greenhouse gas mitigation opportunities. You would also be considering all these co-benefits that might occur. So that was session 1 and session 2. Looking for the remainder of today, we'll be focusing on the third component of this training, which is on the modeling, data, and scenario development piece. We have a pretty broad audience here, so people coming from different backgrounds. So today, and we're pretty limited on time. So today, our objective is to provide an overview of models, an overview of how you develop scenarios, just so that we're speaking the same language. If, as we're going through this, you have technical questions, or if there's a specific model or component that you're interested in, please let us know in the chat or in the question session, and we'll take note, and we might need to send some of those or address some of those questions in session 4, just for time's sake, and just to make sure that we're giving you all the right information. So for today, by the end of our session, we hope that you will walk away with an understanding of the process of developing a baseline scenario and low emission pathways, an understanding of data requirements for developing projections, be familiar with some of the best practices for developing transparent LTS scenarios, and be familiar with some of the example models that could be used or that you may consider to consider adopting for your transport planning. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Logan, who will get us started by talking about the overall approach.
Great, thanks, Tarina. So the first topic today is going to be long-term scenario analysis. So I'm going to walk you through this process, and we'll talk about what it is and why it's important. To begin, there's a typology of long-term strategies. There's not a standard format for what a country's long-term strategy might look like. However, there are kind of 3 primary categories that predominate today. So the first one is a declaration of intent. You might think of this as a vision. And what this does is just indicates an overall ambition, maybe outlines some of the challenges and opportunities. But really, it's planning that vision, and what it does is it prompts discussion. There's also the second category, the international long-term pledge, or a top-down type of strategy. And what this looks like is some kind of long-term emission reduction goal is set for the country or the sector at the top, and that has to be translated down into implementation. So this requires the need to backcast. This is the opposite of forecasting, so it's kind of estimating backwards in time what the sectoral emission pathway might look like. So the policy is set from up top, and then a policy roadmap has to be developed to ultimately meet that goal. The third type of long-term strategy is a long-term scenario analysis, or you could think of this as a bottom-up strategy. And what happens here is there are model-based scenarios that are developed using different assumptions, different technology options, different pathways for low emissions development, and then building that scenario analysis up to come up with a long-term goal. So what does that process look like? Well, this slide kind of outlines generally what the LTS development process looks like. You can think of this as a cyclical cycle or a cyclical process where typically you start by setting a goal. That's the top down that I just mentioned. You start with the goal or the vision, and then you go through this process. Alternatively, you might have a bottom up process where you start with the analysis and end up setting the goal as kind of the final step. You'll also see that throughout the process, stakeholder engagement and transparency are key to each of these steps. So infused in this process, you're constantly engaging with stakeholders. You're constantly outlining and documenting your assumptions, your data use, that kind of stuff. So this is the general process of developing the LTS. So let's take a look step by step. So the first step, as I mentioned, is typically goal setting. We're going to go with the assumption that it is goal setting. And so what this step is you create a goal, and what it does is it helps guide the rest of the analyses. Once you have your information, you can design a goal that's realistic yet ambitious. And you should also develop this goal in collaboration with multiple stakeholders. What this does is it ensures buy-in. It ensures that you're meeting the needs of your stakeholders. It makes sure that people have a voice in the process. And the other thing about setting a goal is you should strive to set a SMART goal. And that's an acronym that stands for specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time bound. And those are 5 characteristics of a really effective goal. By including these different characteristics, what you do is you make sure that a goal is understood and can be attained. So what we've done here is provided an example of what a SMART goal might look like. So country X will reduce net GHG emissions 80% by 2050 compared to 2005 levels. So it's pretty specific. We're talking about country X. We're talking about net GHG emissions. We have an actual figure there. It's measurable. We know that we can measure greenhouse gas emissions. It's actionable. We know that there are actions that we can take to mitigate greenhouse gases. And it's also realistic, at least in this hypothetical context. And finally, it's time bound. We have a timeline that we're looking at achieving this goal by. So this is an example of how you can go about the goal setting process. The second step is starting to develop a baseline scenario. So you can think of this as how much greenhouse gases would I be emitting if I did not take any further action. A baseline is also known as a business as usual or BAU scenario. What it basically does is it describes what greenhouse gas emissions would look like if nothing changed, if everything remained as it was. And the purpose of this is to help you compare any kind of future action to what would occur in the absence of it. So it's also called a reference case in a lot of instances. So there are 4 general actions to take to begin this baseline development process. The first is starting with historical greenhouse gas inventory. Most countries already have this information on hand. It might be in your national communications. It might be in your NDC. You might have this information on hand or be able to access it pretty quickly. Typically, these inventories are a couple of years prior to the current year. So the most recent data might be 2016 or 2018. But what you do next is you start to define assumptions that might impact future greenhouse gas emissions. And those assumptions typically include some kind of rate of population growth, some kind of estimated economic growth rate. You might look at technology adoption rates, a number of different variables that might inform those assumptions. And then you apply those assumptions to that historical data in a process to estimate the gap between the current year and the most recent year of historical data, and then project out through 2050. So that's basically a process of taking historical data and those assumptions and projecting out from the most recent historical year. And then at the end of that, what you do is you document your data sources, your assumptions, your methodologies. You fulfill that transparency component. And to kind of give you an example of what a baseline might look like, what we have here is an example from a recent inventory and baseline of the state of Delaware in the United States. This is showing the net BAU emissions by sector through 2050. And what it does is it highlights some of those pieces I was just mentioning. So you can see that historical data from 2005 to 2017 is represented here. There's a nice black bar there indicating the time when it changes from historical to projected data. So this was conducted in 2020, but the most recent data was through 2017. So the years 2018 to 2019 were estimated and then projected from 2020 to 2050. The other thing that's really nice about this example is that it's broken down by sector, and you can slice this data a number of different ways. But one thing I've done here is sliced it by sector, so you can start to more easily analyze the data. So you can see right off the bat there's 3 primary sources that are accounting for most of this data. You can see how that's changed over time, and right off the bat we're already being able to analyze this data and start making analyses of the data. So this is a really helpful exercise for setting up the process to identify mitigation actions, which is the 3rd step here. So this is the point where practitioners start to identify and prioritize any kind of policy tools, any kind of actions that they can implement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions compared to the BAU scenario. So this is a graphic you'll remember from session 2, the Avoid, Shift, Improve framework. This can be a reference point when you start thinking about potential mitigation actions in the transport sector. So this could be a point where you start to identify what the possible actions are out there. And then once you've identified what's possible, what you need to start doing is prioritizing mitigation actions. This is a process that's very much context dependent and will be determined by your country's needs. It'll be determined by your objectives and your goals and your data. But generally, you can start to prioritize this based on what your goals are and the information you have on hand. And the other thing to consider when you start prioritizing is that transport actions also deliver non-transport impacts. They have both GHG reductions and development benefits as well. So in that prioritization process, you should also start to think about co-benefits. You should think about these other development impacts that we have listed here, like environmental and energy security and economics and quality of life. And then also just remember, harkening back to that graphic, include stakeholder consultation in this process, because different stakeholders will have very different prioritization criteria, and it's important that you weigh all those different voices when you begin this process. This is a callback of the ASI framework and how different actions can have different impacts on those different development goals. So I would encourage you to use this as a reference point when you first start to identify some of those potential actions and you start to think about the prioritization process. You might have as one of your criteria that it has all positive impacts or no negative impacts or something like that. And this can be kind of a first cut when you start to consider those co-benefits. Then the next step is starting to develop a mitigation way. So it's more than just outlining some potential actions that you could implement. What you need to do next is start projecting the expected emissions reductions based on different combinations of mitigation actions, based on different details, based on slightly nuanced scenarios. So countries can start to develop these scenarios based on their priority mitigation actions, and then start to think about how they might be implemented somewhat differently to start to develop different pathways. So you can start to create kind of a suite of pathways that will help in your prioritization process and also in your ability to determine how to implement the specific actions. It's also worth noting that countries can estimate the change in greenhouse gas emissions that would occur under each scenario, and then compare that back to the baseline. So remembering that there was a purpose in creating that baseline. It's to compare these mitigation pathways to what would occur if nothing else changed. And furthermore, we note here that scenarios can be reviewed, they can be compared to other scenarios, and they can also be revised over time. It's also worth noting that scenarios alone will not provide the path to decarbonization. And what we're getting at here is just having a plan on paper or just an analysis on paper isn't necessarily enough. You have to also have a plan that can be implemented correctly and effectively. And you also need to consider other factors that might influence your plan, such as having more ambitious climate policies, thinking about how technologies will change over time, thinking about financing, considerations such as those. And then finally, the analysis, again, should be developed in conjunction with the policymakers and the public. You want to have support from your stakeholders. You want them to have buy-in. You want to make sure that they believe the plan can be implemented, that they think it's reasonable. And finally, we want to make sure that the results are equitable. So we have one example of what this looks like. If you remember our kind of running example, the United States long-term strategy. In that strategy plan, they considered two different pathways to lower transportation-related greenhouse gases. The first one is the MCS benchmark, and this was the idea of rapidly deploying clean vehicles, assuming that 60% of light-duty vehicles would be electric or hydrogen fueled by 2050, but there would be a slower transition for these heavy-duty vehicles. The alternative was this smart growth scenario, which addressed greenhouse gases by limiting growth in vehicle kilometers traveled as an alternative strategy. And that under that strategy, they assumed there'd be improved mass transit and urban planning, but a lower uptake of those electric or hydrogen fuel vehicles. And you can see the results mapped out in the second and third column. You can see how they're different compared to the baseline and how they're different compared to each other based on the different assumptions that led to different pathways. There are two more steps. There's the implementation process and the monitoring and evaluation process. However, those are a little bit outside of the scope of this training today. So we're going to pause here and we're going to dive into data needs next.
Great. Thanks, Logan. That was a really succinct but full review. I do want to pause. I do see a couple of, I mean, I really appreciate people bringing questions forward. I see a couple of questions posted. So I want to pause here just to take those questions before we move on so we don't go too long before addressing them. So Gopal, I see that you've asked a question, which was, could you please mention some other country examples which fall under these three typologies? So Logan, do you mind just going back to the typology slide? Great, thank you. So the declaration of intent. So this is one which is describing an overall ambition, challenges, and opportunities. So one example that we could cite would be Vietnam's Green Growth Action Plan, which is an action plan until 2050, but it's very high level, and it sets a vision for how the country wants to be in terms of, I believe the categories include things like greener lifestyles, greener production, and maybe I think it was green finance. There are three pillars to that plan. So that would be an example of a vision. They're not specifics in it. It just tells, it gives a framework for the provinces to develop their own action plans to implement in response. The second option, the International Long-Term Pledge, which is a top-down approach, which is generally, I mean, fundamentally, it's usually a government official or minister or someone who's made a political commitment for the country. And examples of that, I believe, are Fiji and France, who started with the goal first and then did the backcasting. And then finally, in terms of long-term scenario analysis, so really starting with the data, playing with the scenarios and figuring out what your pathways might look like and what your goal could ambitiously but realistically be. We've talked about it quite a bit in our example. It would be the US and developed their long-term strategy using this approach. Canada also did something similar, and I want to say Ukraine, but I don't recall, so I don't want to commit to it. But I know the US and Canada are two examples. Gopal, I hope that answers your question. Certainly can give a few more examples in session 4 if you want to dig deeper into that. I also see a question from Namita asking if there's any particular reason why projections are done in these parts. So I think, Logan, to your example, why would you not project from 2017 to 2050 in one go? I think, Nayel, do you want to take this first question, and then Logan, if you want to fill in anything that we might miss?
Yeah, so there are several reasons why you want to parse like that. I think the key one will be so you can introduce new variables as you simulate or estimate future conditions. Say, for instance, that a particular policy regarding electric vehicles or energy use or things like that that may impact the emissions. Those can be taken into consideration. In general, you're doing some sort of discrete choice model that would well, not necessarily a discrete choice model, but a discrete model that will give you specific results for ranges, and you can tailor those ranges. But having just a big range from 2017 to 2050 might leave all those externalities, that might be influencing the emissions on the long term. At the end of the day, that is also going to be heavily depending on the model that you use. Some models are more flexible, others are less flexible. So I would basically suggest that you assess those two key things. One will be, how do you introduce those new policies or new variables that may impact changes in population, changes in oil prices, changes in, again, in specific policies. And also to assess what is the capability of your model. If you can only estimate on chunks of 5 years, because of that is also what the data is allowing you to do, then that is what you can do. But if in general you want it to be as granular as possible, so you can estimate and even use that for policy making.
Great.
And that's kind
Thank
of
you,
like
Nayel.
the short answer.
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
Namita, do you have any other follow-up questions to that? I know that was quite a bit.
No, I think I got the gist of it. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. And then Logan, Howard, anything that you might want to add to that? I know you do some of this work as well.
Yeah, I think Niall hit it right on the head. The other thing is that we know what happened more or less in between now and the last historical year, whereas we don't know anything about how the future turns out. So we can use what we know about what occurred in that time period and apply it to the data. That can help tailor it a little bit if needed. But it's not to say that if you don't have the data on hand, or if you just want to get kind of an idea that's not super granular, you can do that process in one action. It won't be as detailed and potentially not as effective, but you can do it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I guess pausing here, we'll have more time to ask questions. Any other questions before we move on to the data discussion? All right, great. Logan, do you mind just advancing back to where we were at? Excellent, thank you. So Logan discussed a little bit about the process, and I think Niall already prompted us to discuss the data. What data is needed to support these long-term analyses, the development of a baseline and development of these mitigation scenarios? So some of the data that you will need might include the historical greenhouse gas emissions. It's probably one of the big pieces, as well as things like emission factors that you're accounting for your fuel or for whatever your estimate might be. Any current policy, so understanding your current policy landscape that would be implemented in the nearer term that might affect your first years in the series. And then in terms of developing your assumptions for what your mitigation pathway would look like, you might need other data such as population change, projected economic growth, data or some kind of data points related to technology change and or adoption. So in transportation, it might include things like the rate of electric vehicle adoption over time, changes in personal vehicle ownership, or changes in fuel composition moving forward. This is just an illustrative list. You will need to analyze your situation or your scenario more closely to better identify these data sets that you might need, but this gets us started. So now that we know what the data that is needed would be, where do you find this data? Again, it really does depend on your domestic circumstances. And I would love to hear from participants on this call your situation. But the sources of data may include things such as the National Statistics Office that you might have in your country, ministry data or documents that are collected. So for example, the Ministry of Transportation or the Ministry of Environment may have studies, past reports and documentations that could be used to inform your LTS development. On the greenhouse gas data side, your national communications or biennial update reports will often have this information, and any kind of supporting spreadsheets or databases that were used to develop those documents. Industry reports may also be useful. So for example, industries may publish reports on their expected growth or expansion of an industry, and that can inform what you think the future would look like for the baseline. Also, academic research, universities or other institutions may be conducting country-specific studies that could be used as a data point that can either inform something in your country, or it might be documenting a mitigation lever and a mitigation application and what happened in a different country that could tell you, if you adopt a certain action, what might happen for you. And finally, there are international sources of data, open data that is available that could be leveraged if you're short on data. For example, the World Bank keeps quite a number of statistics, and the IPCC has some emission data that could potentially be used. As we discuss data, it's really important for us to acknowledge something that many countries struggle with, which is the challenge of having the right data. And that could include having limited access to data, having older data that's not up to date, poor quality data, or data that's, has time series issues. Or, it might also be institutional, that there's not data sharing occurring between the ministries or between the data holders, and that's preventing the development of analyses. These are all challenges that many of us may face in different combinations. However, data limitations can impact the resolution of your analysis, or maybe the complexity of your analysis, but it doesn't necessarily have to stop you from starting the process of doing a long-term vision and developing those pathways. You can work with the data that's available, and what that means is that your model and your scenarios would have to be simplified, and that it would need to be accompanied by caveats. And this is where the transparency component comes in. Having good documentation of that can help give a fuller picture to the analysis that you're conducting. If you're dealing with limited data, you could also look to leverage information trends from neighboring countries or countries with similar circumstances or adopting similar policies to see if that can be applied in your context. And that might involve making some additional assumptions and addressing some uncertainty. Again, international sources such as IPCC and World Bank may also be a complement to the data you do have available. I do want to comment that even if you have limited data, starting the process of developing an LTS from wherever you are starting from is a good signal, because it signals to the international community, it can signal to donors that you have an intent of continuing to do long-term planning, and it starts to set you down on a path. And whatever you're doing in terms of data modeling, scenario analysis can, as we've mentioned in session 1 and 2, be improved over time. It doesn't have to be a static document. It's something that you can come back and revisit. And then I have bolded on the slide, it's just very important to document this. Like if you're starting and you intend to continue to communicate and revise, to document your data sources, document your limitations. It's okay to have uncertainties, but make sure it's documented that you know what they are, and identifying areas for improvements so that you can communicate for future teams or for others where you see opportunities to improve your analysis. And finally, just to revisit, because I do want to say alignment of, touch on the alignment of LTS and NDCs. The 2050 outcomes are dependent on what's happening in in the near term, so on the 2030 timeframe. So as you're developing analysis, as you're using data, it's important to consider that the data and models that you're using for the 2050s planning is similar or the same as the 2030 or the NDC planning, right? I guess it's this idea of comparing similar things or apples to apples, as the phrase goes. To be able to do that in your country, you would need to start to think about also some of the institutional arrangements and data sharing agreements that need to occur to allow this to happen and to have cohesion between these two documents. So I'm going to pause there, and maybe because we've been doing quite a bit of talking, and just pause and see, are there any questions from the group here about what we're talking about as we talk about analyses and we talk about the data? Is there anyone in this session who might be familiar with this NDC process, which Logan described, and could share their experiences with developing it, for example? I'm just going to pause for a bit just in case people are shy to speak. Okay. Another question I would like to throw out would be just to see, and whether someone would want to bring it up here or it comes up in the breakout groups, which is, as we talk about the amount of data that is needed to do these analyses, how many people, I guess, is there anyone who has a comment on whether or not it feels like it's, how do I describe it? It's like too much, like, is developing these scenarios, is it achievable, or do you feel like there are lots of barriers or challenges? And if there are what are those barriers and challenges?
Hi, Marina. I can start.
Hi, Gopal. Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Most of the issues, most of the barriers has been already covered in the presentation. But based on my experience, I just wanted to re-emphasize that the main challenges the developing countries, particularly, they face is about this data availability and quality of data they have. Sometimes it's known to exist, and sometimes occurs in the very poor quality. And so, but as mentioned in your presentation, it would be the good starting point what we have and build on that, and on continuous basis improve it over the time. So, and in addition to that, another important aspect is this institutional arrangement or clarity among different stakeholders or data owners or the institutions. This applies to not only transport sector in overall for all kind of this transparency work, as well as for this kind of scenario development process. Many data remains there, but in the piecemeal approach, with the various stakeholders, with the different jurisdiction, and sometimes there is the challenges for the coordination among them, and sometimes there is the lack of clarity on at the regulation level or the mandate level, so that there is a type of hesitance or the conflict of authorities, like why should I share the data, why should I contribute for this kind of process. So there is, because of that coordination or the lack of the clarity in the mandate. So if at the government level or at the top level, if there is any kind of such kind of clarity on institutional arrangement or mandate, that would really help. That would really facilitate the data collaboration and sharing among the various stakeholders. And third, importantly, this kind of data and scenario analysis or this kind of process are generally happens in the country on the project basis or on the consultants basis. Consultants comes in, do all the analysis, and they leave. And when they leave, there is no institutional memory. If you want to improve or you want to carry on in future, which is very difficult for improvement or any further work in future. So this project basis approach generally is not facilitating this kind of work in perpetual or on a continuous basis. That means we generally fail to establish a system which will help the country to work on this on a continuous basis. So these these are the this is the most important issue I face. So I think the countries should strive to build the internal capacity or institutionalize these process within their institutional arrangement, so that this can be done without any problem in future as well. So these are my observation from my side. Thanks.
Thank you, Gopal. That's really helpful and really insightful. I think you caught a lot of important parts. Penwadi, I see that you're writing a message, but I'm curious, would you like to speak a little bit more about, I think, Thailand's experience and your comment?
I just want to add one more comment on the issue that we have to think about it for the projection. Like, I think we should be take into account on the external parameter which might be affect to the accuracy of the projection or the scenario setting result, something like that. Like, for example, like from the COVID situation, it affect to the economic setting, something like that. This is the external parameter that we have to think about it when we set the assumption for the projection, something like this. Just my idea.
Okay, Penwadi, you're very quiet on the line, but I think I caught what you were saying. I just want to reiterate, and please let me know if I'm wrong. I think you're saying that when you're developing projections, that there may be other external factors that need to be accounted for on top of the data. Is that what you were saying?
Right. Can you hear me? Sorry.
No, I can, but it's just a little bit quiet. So if you can speak up just a little bit more, I think it'd be a little bit easier to hear you.
Sorry. I just want to share the idea that the issue that when we think about the assumption for the projection, even for the BAU case or for the mitigation scenario setting, we have to think on the external parameter, not only like the economic sector or socio parameter, something like that. We have to think on the external parameter that might be affect to the projection result, something like this. This is just to share the idea, to share my
Thank
thought.
you. Thank you. When you say external parameter, can you give an example?
Like policy, the information on the policy, right, and all. For example, like in the case of COVID situation, it affects to the economic cost. So if we refer to the past of the socio-economic, like in Thailand, we have the socio-economic around 5%, but during the COVID situation, it dropped down to only about 2 or 3%, something like that. If we think on this issue and we try to analyze in this case, we will get another result.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure as anyone's doing planning right now, COVID is going to be a factor for all of us, and any policy changes or policies introduced would also be another external parameter. Thank you, Panwadi. That's really helpful. Before we move on to models, are there any other comments? I think some really great points were brought up about taking into account these external parameters. I think Gopal was commenting on some of the challenges that have been faced by countries in terms of data sharing and understanding why sharing should occur, and just the sustainability of the process, especially when consultants or an external party might come in and address something, and the knowledge or information is not left behind. I think these are great things to continue discussing as we get into our breakout groups, but not seeing any more comments popping up on the chat bar. I will pass the mic over to Howard to talk about models. And I did see a few people hop on the call, so welcome to those who've joined us midway. We welcome you to this training.
Great. Thanks, Dorina. So now that we've talked about both scenario analysis and some of the data needs for LTS development, we want to shift to talking about the tools for quantitative analysis. The tools we're talking about here are models, and what models are essentially are tools for exploring different emission reduction pathways, whereas scenarios, which Logan mentioned, allow thinking about different outcomes into the future. The use of these tools in combination is helpful in exploring the different outcomes and identify the best paths forward for your country's LTSs. Models can consider a whole number of factors, including greenhouse gas emissions, economic development, air quality, and human health outcomes, which as we've noted, are all important components of a potential LTS. Models can also vary in their complexity and their scope. Some models can be incredibly simple or incredibly complex, whereas models can cover sectors, entire economies, regions, or specific countries. And these models can actually work together to produce individual outputs. What the important thing to stress when thinking about models is that there are no perfect models. Different models will potentially be used by different countries, depending on what their capacity is and what some of their goals are. And using models is just one of the methods to project emissions pathways on a range of possibilities and outcomes. It's also important to stress that models are limited by data quality and availability. If you do not have access to good data to feed into your model, the results of your model will not be consistent with what might be a likely pathway or outcome. The other important thing with models is to coordinate with stakeholders. When developing models, it's important to work with stakeholders, one, to acquire data inputs, but also to provide a quality control check or an assurance that the outcomes from your models are consistent with what other stakeholders might be identifying. A key component when working with models is also a qualitative narrative. So your model will produce a quantitative assessment, which will have some numeric measure of outcomes, whether that's with greenhouse gas emissions or another environmental result. But this quantitative assessment should be paired with a qualitative narrative. And this narrative is essentially a storyline that provides a clear picture of the different scenarios you're considering with your model. Also the context for the assumptions you're entering into your model, the identification of different drivers of change. These could be things like economic growth, economic growth and development changes, as well as technological change or changes in social preferences, for example. It also helps to describe the different, at the end of your modeling exercise, this narrative also can help describe the outcomes and some of the scenarios and implications of your model. Similar to with data outcomes, there's always this question of, well, what if your country does not possess a model or your research institution does not possess the particular model that you may need to run an analysis related to LTS? That you have several options here to mitigate some of those gaps. First, parties such as the United States and the European Union, these countries often have more resources to invest in robust and powerful models. Often these models can be adapted with the help of these countries to fill the gaps of other countries that may be looking to expand their modeling capacity. Another opportunity is to pair with research institutions, whether that's a ministry pairing with a research institution or a research institution in another country to build capacity for modeling activities. And it's important to stress that the selection of your model is going to be highly dependent on, one, what is the objective of the analysis you're seeking? So whether you're looking to analyze greenhouse gas emissions reductions or another co-benefit such as air quality, which we've discussed. Second, it's important to consider the model in terms of the capacity of the country users and the data availability. So does your country or your institution have the technical expertise to run this model? And will you need outside support to run that model? And also, do you have the data, like we mentioned before, to serve as an input into that model to know that you're having a quality analysis that results in outcomes that can be thought of as being robust and consistent with what your emissions or LTS scenario pathway is projecting. So there's a wide breadth of models that exist at any one time. It's important to note that so this list here includes a number of multi-sector or economy-wide models that exist to inform LTS. These aren't all models used in the globe even at this time, and this environment is frequently changing. And also, not all of these models may fit your specific country's circumstances. So we provide these here for your consideration, and if you the presentation materials will be provided after, where you can read up a little bit more on these individual models. Some countries in the region, such as Vietnam or Indonesia, are already using some of these models, and some we'll discuss in more depth in the next section. In contrast to economy-wide or multi-sector models, there are a number of sectoral models, particularly in the energy sector, which is often where you'll find transportation modeling grouped together. And these models can be used to find sector-specific targets. Here are another set of examples that can be considered, and we'll touch on some of these, or can touch on some of these in subsequent discussion. As I mentioned earlier, institutional pairing is a good way for countries to support LTS modeling development. There was work, there's been a previous project work where local institutions in several countries in the Latin American context have paired with international institutions to support their modeling activities. And as you can see, there's several that support transportation modeling, as well as several institutional pairings based on work that's been done in the United States that we've featured. So briefly, we'll look at a couple of models in a little bit more detail, just to kind of give you a feel for what models are in use. So as we've mentioned the U.S. mid-century strategy for decarbonization, I just want to briefly emphasize that it uses a number of models to support this in-depth analysis. We're happy to answer some questions about these models, but in the interest of time, I will move forward to some of the models used in the international context. And thanks, Logan. So one of the models used that we featured earlier is the 2050 Pathways Calculator. The 2050s Pathway Calculator was created to provide policymakers and the general public in South Africa with a tool to assess different long-term decarbonization pathways and inform that public debate. This calculator, which is available to the public online, allows the user to select different assumptions that drive different emissions and energy consumption outcomes. In transportation sector, this includes assumptions related to modal share, travel demand, low emissions technologies for the transport sector, as well as vehicle efficiency. An important thing to highlight in this section is that these assumptions and the data used as an input for this pathways calculator are all publicly available. Anyone who has access to the website can download the Excel workbook that has these assumptions. So in terms of transparency, it's a very transparent process for anyone to access. The second model I'd like to highlight is the GAINS model. The GAINS model is a model used to estimate mitigation options for air pollution, including greenhouse gas emissions and conventional air pollutants. The GAINS model looks at historic emissions of 10 air pollutants and 6 greenhouse gas emissions and uses these historic baseline pollution numbers to estimate potential emission reductions and their costs from emission control technologies. And echoing the different types of scenario analysis Logan was speaking to before, there are actually 2 different approaches to using this model. The first approach is to estimate the cost and the environmental benefits of different emissions control strategies. This would be if these strategies are being dictated from above as things that the country would like to pursue. Alternatively, the model can also be used to identify the least cost emission control strategies. This could feed into a bottom-up scenario development process as well. And when it comes to data, the GAINS model uses a variety of international energy and industrial statistics, as well as emissions inventories and country supplied data. In terms of complexity, the GAINS model also offers the opportunity for users to select the technical specificity of the model they're using. So they can either choose pre-existing pathways or provide their own data to create a more rich or more detailed and granular model, depending on their level of expertise. So if a country is choosing to use the GAINS model for the first time, they may elect to use pre-existing pathways, but as they develop their own data, they can use that to plug into the GAINS model. And this model's been in use both internationally in Europe, but also particularly in South Asia and China, where the model has been tailored to fit regional conditions. And with that, I'll pass it back to Jarina for our group exercise.